Hi there, I'm Lou,
And I'm Lee.
and this is Uncovering History.
Hello and welcome to our 8th Uncovering History podcast episode. Today we will be covering the notorious Ed Kemper, and for today's episode, Lucy has done the research, so I will pass you over to Lucy.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to start off with an overview based on Ed Kemper. Now, most of you probably would have heard of Ed Kemper or Edmund Kemper, especially if you have watched Mindhunter. So, Edmund Kemper III was born December the 18th, 1948. He is an American serial killer, serial rapist, and necrophile who murdered 10 people, including his paternal grandparents and mother. He is noted for his height of 6 feet and 9 inches, so that's about just over 2 meters. And for his high intellect, he possesses an IQ of around 145. Kemper was nicknamed the Co-Ed Killer, as most of his victims were female college students.
Absolutely, yeah. His intelligence is something that's always fascinated me, especially how sort of articulate he is.
There is a sort of common trend, though, with the serial killers that we've been looking at. Most of them, choose the vulnerable, unfortunately, female college student victim.
Yeah, no, they pick their prey very, very carefully because obviously they want to succeed.
So he was born in California, and Kemper had a troubled upbringing. So his parents divorced, and as a child he moved to Montana with his abusive mother before returning to California, where he murdered his paternal grandparents when he was 15. He was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia by court psychiatrists and sentenced to the Atascadero State Hospital as a criminally insane juvenile. So he was released at the age of 21 after convincing psychiatrists he was, in fact, rehabilitated, and Kemper was regarded as non-threatening by his future victims. He targeted young female hitchhikers during his killing spree, luring them into his vehicle and driving them to secluded areas where he would murder them before taking their corpse back to his home to be decapitated, dismembered, and violated. Kemper then murdered his mother and one of her friends before turning himself into the authorities. Found sane and guilty at his trial in 1973, Kemper requested the death penalty for his crimes. The capital punishment was suspended in California at the time, however, and he instead received 8 concurrent life sentences. Since then, he has been incarcerated and still is in the California Medical Facility.
It's a very, very interesting life. It's not something that's of the norm. And what I found interesting was that, he requested the death penalty because he believed he should be punished for his sins.
Which is really uncommon because, when you're looking at the profile of a normal serial killer, they tend to gloat in what they've done and not necessarily want to be punished.
Absolutely, they revel in the popularity that they gain.
So we're going to start off now looking at his early life, because one of the most important things about this case is really the background of Kemper's home life, his childhood, his influences as well.
Okay.
So, Edmund Kemper III was born in Burbank, California on December the 18th, 1948. He was the middle child and only son born to his mother Clarnell Elizabeth Kemper and his father Edmund Kemper II. Edmund II was a World War II veteran who, after the war, tested nuclear weapons in the Pacific Proving Ground before returning to California, where he worked as an electrician. Now, his mother, Clarnell, often complained about her husband's menial electrician job, and he later said suicide missions in wartime and the atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with her, and that Clarnell affected him more than 396 days and nights of fighting on the front did.
That's quite a statement.
Well, it really gives you kind of an insight to their relationship. He clearly detested the woman.
Yeah, it's not a happy home.
So it's fair to say that their relationship between Kemper's mother and father was far from ideal and would have definitely had an impact on his childhood, his processing ability and the way in which he learnt to treat other people. And it's fair to say that, children do pick up a lot from their parents.
Yeah, they're sponges.
Exactly. And, when you have such a negative environment when you're a child, it's almost natural for you to accept that's normal.
True, I guess, but then with all the sadness that's involved in the world, not everyone then goes on to become what he became.
Yeah, there's no excuse. You're completely right. He also displayed some truly awful behaviour during his childhood. So early on, he exhibited antisocial behaviour such as cruelty to animals. Now, cruelty to animals is one of the things that is a very common trait of future serial killers as a child.
Unfortunately, yeah, lots of the really prolific killers, especially in the history of the United States, all started with animal cruelty.
So at the age of 10, he buried a pet cat alive, and once it died, he dug it up, decapitated it, and mounted its head on a spike.
Sinister, horrible.
You don't really know what to say to that, do you?
No, that's pretty vile.
As a cat lover, that is very upsetting.
And we have 5. So.
I know, 5. Okay, so Kemper later stated that he had derived pleasure from successfully lying to his family about killing the cat. And at the age of 13, he killed another family cat when he perceived it to be favouring his younger sister, Allen Lee Kemper, over him, and he kept pieces of it in his closet until his mother found them.
Again, very, very odd signs, something that should be picked up immediately and looked into in detail, but I guess when you're part of a broken home, the mum and dad don't really care enough to look into it.
Exactly, and I think, this was the key possible moment for an adult to step in.
Absolutely.
And kind of look into this. What's going on? Let's get this child some help. So not surprisingly, during his youth, he also experimented by playing some shocking games with his sibling. He stated in later interviews that some of his favourite games to play as a child were gas chamber and electric chair, in which he asked his younger sister to tie him up and flip an imaginary switch. He would then tumble over and writhe on the floor, pretending that he was being executed by gas inhalation or electric shock. He also had near-death experiences as a child, once when his elder sister tried to push him in front of a train, and another time when she successfully pushed him into the deep end of a swimming pool where he almost drowned.
Again, it's just not right.
His childhood is clearly fraught with just very negative experiences, mainly delivered from him, but also, like we said, surrounding his kind of relationships with his siblings as well as his parents. So Kemper had a close relationship with his father and was devastated when his parents separated in 1957, causing him to be raised by Clarnell, his mother, in Helena, Montana. He had a severely dysfunctional relationship with his mother, a neurotic, domineering alcoholic who frequently belittled, humiliated, and abused him. Clarnell often made her son sleep in a locked basement because she feared that he would harm his sisters, regularly mocked him for his large size, so he stood at about 6 feet 4 inches by the age of 15, which is huge, and derided him as a real weirdo. She also refused to show him affection out of the fear that she would turn him gay, and told the young Kemper that he reminded her of his father and that no woman would ever love him.
That's really difficult, especially being that tall at a young age. Even the children around you would probably make comments, so he wouldn't really have an escape from it, I guess.
Well, having this kind of dysfunctional relationship at home, probably being bullied at school, everything is negative for him. Mm-hmm. Everything. And again, this isn't, giving him any excuses for the later horrific crimes that he committed. But you can start to see that, his life has been plagued from a very early age.
Yeah, there's a trend, yeah.
So his relationship with his mother was clearly not just dysfunctional, but completely void of any normality that you would expect from a normal, loving family. And at 14 years old, Kemper ran away from home in order to reunite with his father. However, once he arrived at his father's home in Van Nuys, California, he found that his father had remarried and had started another family. His father eventually sent him to live with his paternal grandparents in North Fork. Kemper absolutely hated this. He described his grandfather as senile and discussed how his grandmother would constantly emasculate him and his grandfather.
So I guess it's generational, isn't it? His mother's experiences are probably based on her own experiences as a child, and as such she's now showcasing them to him.
Yeah, and that basically covers his sort of very dysfunctional, very negative childhood, and it kind of leads on to the future and, you know, the significance of his killings, I guess, based on this relationship specifically with his mother.
Yep.
So we're going to look at his first murder. So on August the 27th, 1964, at the age of 15, Kemper was sitting at the kitchen table with his grandmother Maud Matilda Huey Kemper, and she was born in 1897, when they had an argument. So, enraged, Kemper stormed off and retrieved a rifle that his grandfather had given him for hunting. The rifle had been confiscated because he used it to shoot animals. So again, we've got that, you know, reoccurring trend that he is obsessed with killing animals.
And just like serial killers in general have a lack of empathy, especially for animals.
Which is kind of a telltale sign, isn't it?
Mm.
So he then re-entered the kitchen and fatally shot his grandmother in the head before firing twice more into her back.
So yeah, we're already seeing again that's pretty violent.
Pretty violent, I think, is an understatement. It's your grandmother.
Mm.
Awful. And her last words reportedly were, "Oh, you'd better not be shooting the birds again." Some accounts also mention that she suffered with multiple post-mortem stab wounds with one of the knives in the kitchen. So, you know, this first murder, remember he's only 15 at this age, was incredibly brutal, incredibly violent. And for a 15-year-old, it's even more shocking.
Well, he's already showing from when he originally began to hurt animals, he would also violate them post-mortem, so he's showing a common trend now, which is beginning to become like part of his MO, it seems.
And when Kemper's grandfather, so Edmund Kemper, he was born in 1892, returned from grocery shopping, he went outside and fatally shot him in the driveway next to his car. And he was unsure of what to do next, so he phoned his mother, who told him to contact the local police. So he called the police and waited to be taken into custody.
And just to add something that I read in the past, which I found quite interesting, seeing as they don't usually show empathy, is that he reported that he went out and shot his granddad because he didn't want his granddad to see his grandma, and as such didn't want his granddad to be in pain.
Yeah, and he also said after his arrest that he just wanted to see what it felt like to kill his grandma, and testified that he killed his grandfather, like you said, so he'd not have to find out that his wife was dead, and that he would be angry with Kemper for what he'd done.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, something that doesn't really fit the trend or the pattern.
So psychiatrist Donald Lund, who interviewed Kemper during adulthood, wrote, "In his way, he had avenged the rejection of both his father and his mother. And Kemper's crimes were deemed incomprehensible for a 15-year-old to commit, and court psychiatrists diagnosed him as paranoid schizophrenic, then sent him to Atascadero, I'll get there eventually, State Hospital, a maximum security facility that houses mentally ill convicts."
So once again, it's just emphasising that his life is never going to be a normal life, and I guess we know why.
So on December the 18th, 1969, Kemper was released from prison, and against the advice from the psychiatrist, he was released on parole to his mother, Clarnell, who lived a short drive from her work at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I mean, that's probably the one person you don't want to release this child to.
Yeah, there's a lot of missteps. I mean, this all began as a result of him leaving and not wanting to live with his mother. So after all the tragedy and the horrific violence that we've seen, the last place you would put that child back is with his mother.
Exactly. And interestingly, his record was expunged, and his final report from Atascadero stated, "If I were to see this patient without having any history available or getting any history from him, I would think that we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free of any psychiatric illnesses. It is my opinion that he has made a very excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation, and I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be any danger to himself or to any member of society. And since it may allow him more freedom as an adult to develop his potential, I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunction of his juvenile records."
That's something that's quite common even today, is that especially juveniles that commit crimes, often their records are sealed just to try and give them a chance to be rehabilitated.
I understand in some cases where, you know, children have committed crimes and their criminal records are expunged. But this is not just a petty crime. This isn't taking a sandwich from a shop, which, obviously is illegal. But in comparison to murdering your grandparents brutally, I think there's a huge difference here.
Yeah, I guess as well, we don't know what the psychiatrists know. So do they know the history of him as a child, or do they simply know this one event which caused everything to unfold?
So when he had saved enough money, Kemper moved out to live with a friend in Alameda, California. There, he still complained of being unable to get away from his mother because she regularly phoned him and paid him surprise visits. So his mother is a constant in his life. So once he's released from juvenile imprisonment, he's obviously sent to his mother's. He saves up some money, goes and lives with a friend, but his mother is still constantly on his case.
Yeah.
He often had financial difficulties, which resulted in his frequently returning to his mother's apartment in Aptos. At a Santa Cruz beach, Kemper met a student from Turlock High School to whom he became engaged in March 1973. The engagement was broken off after Kemper's second arrest, and his fiancée's parents requested her name not to be revealed to the public, which is understandable. So the same year that he began working for the Highway Division, Kemper was hit by a car while riding a motorcycle that he had recently purchased. His arm was very badly injured in the crash, and he received a $15,000 settlement. So in today's sort of standing, that's about $90,000. So he then used that money to buy a car, and as he was driving around in the 1969 Ford Galaxy he bought with that money, he noticed a large number of young women hitchhiking and began storing plastic bags, knives, blankets, and handcuffs in his car. He then began picking up young women and peacefully letting them go. And according to Kemper, he picked up around 150 such hitchhikers before he felt homicidal sexual urges, which he called his little Zappos, and began acting on them.
It's a very interesting name for it. And I guess we're already seeing that there's that premeditation. He knows what's going to happen eventually. It's just a case of either building up the courage or finding the right victim in his eyes.
So between May 1972 and April 1973, Kemper killed 8 people. He would pick up female students who were hitchhiking and take them to isolated areas where he would shoot, stab, smother, or strangle them. During this 11-month murder spree, he killed 5 college students, 1 high school student, his mother, and his mother's best friend. Kemper had stated in interviews that he often searched for victims after having arguments with his mother, and that she refused to introduce him to women attending the university where she worked. He recalled, "She would say, 'You're just like your father. You don't deserve to get to know them.'" Psychiatrists and Kemper himself have espoused the belief that the young women were surrogates for his ultimate target, his mother.
Makes sense, yeah. I guess once again building up the courage and the confidence and just getting himself ready in a very sort of twisted way.
So we're going to look at some specific victims and murders. So we're going to start off with Mary Ann Pesce and Anita Luchessa.
Okay.
So on May the 7th, 1972, Kemper was driving in Berkeley, California, when he picked up 2 18-year-old hitchhiking students from Fresno State University, Mary Ann Pesce and Anita Mary Luchessa, with the pretense of taking them to Stanford University. After driving for an hour, he managed to reach the secluded wooded area near Alameda, California, with which he was familiar from his work at the Highway Department, without alerting his passengers that he had changed directions from where they wanted to go. It was there that he handcuffed Pesce and locked Luchessa in the trunk, then stabbed and strangled Pesce to death, subsequently killing Luchessa in a similar manner. Kemper later confessed that while handcuffing Pesce, he brushed the back of his hand against one of her breasts and it embarrassed him, adding that he said, "Whoops, I'm sorry," or something like that, after grazing her breast, despite murdering her minutes later.
Yeah, that's not an adult reaction. That's kind of, I guess, attesting to his mental state, which probably isn't that of someone of his age.
So Kemper put both of the women's bodies in the trunk of his Ford Galaxy and returned to his apartment. He was stopped on the way by a police officer for having a broken tail light, but the officer did not detect the corpses in the car. Kemper's roommate was not at home, so he took the bodies into his apartment where he photographed and had sexual intercourse with the naked corpses before dismembering them. He then put the body parts into plastic bags, which he later abandoned near Loma Prieta mountain. Before disposing of Pesci's and Lucchesa's severed heads in a ravine, Kemper engaged in irrumatio with both of them. In August of that year, Pesci's skull was found on Loma Prieta mountain. An extensive search failed to turn up the rest of Pesci's remains or a trace of Lucchesa.
It's a horrible end. It's a horrible set of events that have unfolded.
So we're going to move on to Eiko Ku. So on the evening of September the 14th, 1972, Kemper picked up a 15-year-old dance student named Eiko Ku, who had decided to hitchhike to a dance class after missing her bus. He again drove to a remote area where he pulled a gun on Ku before accidentally locking himself out of his car. However, Ku let him back inside despite the fact that the gun was still in the car. Back inside the car, he proceeded to choke her unconscious, rape her, and kill her. Kemper subsequently packed Ku's body into the trunk of his car and went to a nearby bar to have a few drinks, then returned to his apartment. He later confessed that after exiting the bar, he opened the trunk of the car, admiring his catch like a fisherman. Back at his apartment, he had sexual intercourse with the corpse, then dismembered and disposed of the remains in a similar manner as his previous two victims. Ku's mother called the police to report the disappearance of her daughter and put up hundreds of flyers asking for information, but she did not receive any responses regarding her daughter's location or status.
So it's ongoing. The MO is definitely building, and it's horrific the way that he would deal with his victims.
So that moves us on to Cindy Shaw. So on January the 7th, 1973, Kemper, who had moved back in with his mother, was driving around the Cabrillo College campus when he picked up 18-year-old student Cynthia Ann Cindy Shaw. He drove to a wooded area and fatally shot her with a .22 caliber pistol. He then placed her body in the trunk of his car and drove to his mother's house, where he kept her body hidden in a closet in his room overnight. When his mother left for work the next morning, he had sexual intercourse with her and removed the bullet from Shaw's corpse, then dismembered and decapitated her in his mother's bathtub.
So I guess this comes back to, again, that he only tends to have sex with them mostly when they're post-mortem, so I assume it's down to just his lack of confidence or a sinister motive that was the prime opportunity for him.
Kemper kept Shaw's severed head for several days, regularly engaging in irrumatio with it, then buried it in his mother's garden facing upward towards her bedroom. After his arrest, he stated that he did this because his mother always wanted people to look up to her. He discarded the rest of Shaw's remains by throwing them off a cliff. Over the course of the following few weeks, all except her head and right hand were discovered and pieced together like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. A pathologist determined that Shaw had been cut into pieces with a power saw.
So again, it's becoming more violent, and you can see, I guess, how he's evolving.
He's just brutal.
It is.
It's disgusting, this man. He really is. And Rosalind Thorpe and Alison Liu are next. And on February the 5th, 1973, after a heated argument with his mother again, Kemper left his house in search of possible victims. With heightened suspicion of a serial killer preying on hitchhikers in the Santa Cruz area, students were advised to accept rides only from cars with university stickers on them. Kemper had been able to obtain such a sticker, as his mother worked at the University of California, Santa Cruz.
It's terrible because that just puts him back into the safety bracket, somewhere where people will feel comfortable getting into his car.
He then encountered 23-year-old Rosalind Heather Thorpe and 20-year-old Alice Helen Allison Liu on the UCSC campus. According to Kemper, Thorpe entered his car first, reassuring Liu to also enter. He first fatally shot Thorpe and then Liu with his .22 caliber pistol and wrapped their bodies in blankets. Kemper again brought his victims back to his mother's house. This time he beheaded them in his car and carried the headless corpses into his mother's house to have sexual intercourse with them. He then dismembered the bodies, removed the bullets to prevent identification, and discarded their remains the next morning. Some remains were found at Eden Canyon a week later, and more were found near Highway 1 in March. When questioned in an interview as to why he decapitated his victims, he explained, "The head trip fantasies were a bit like a trophy. You know, the head is where everything is at. The brain, eyes, mouth, that's the person. I remember being told as a kid, you cut off the head and the body dies. The body is nothing after the head is cut off. Well, that's not quite true. There's a lot left in the girl's body without the head."
It's pretty morbid.
And the fact that he's recounting this from a childhood conversation, again, makes you wonder who he was talking to about this with.
Yeah, and I guess once again we're seeing that everything is occurring after an event with his mother. So if this had been tracked down and dealt with, I'm not saying that the murders wouldn't have occurred, but maybe something could have been done to curb the anger to an extent or stop him way before it got to this stage.
So this moves us on to Clarnell Strandberg, his mother, and Sally Hallett. So on April the 20th, 1973, after coming home from a party, 52-year-old Clarnell Elizabeth Strandberg awakened her son with her arrival. While sitting in her bed reading a book, she noticed Kemper enter her room and said to him, "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." Kemper replied, "No, good night." He then waited for her to fall asleep while he snuck back into her room to bludgeon her with a claw hammer and slit her throat with a penknife. He then decapitated her and engaged in irrimatio with her severed head, then used it as a dartboard. Kemper stated that he put her head on a shelf and screamed at it for an hour, threw darts at it, and ultimately smashed her face in.
I guess this is what it's all come down to, hasn't it? Everything else has been leading up to this point where his rage is channeled at his mother, and that's the sole point of existence, I guess.
He also cut out her tongue and larynx and put them in the garbage disposal. However, the garbage disposal could not break down the tough vocal cords and ejected the tissue back into the sink. He said later that seemed appropriate, as much as she had bitched about and screamed and yelled at me over so many years.
I guess, yeah, I mean, there's some symbolism there. He's obviously trying to destroy the vocal cords in reference to stopping his mum talking once and for all.
Kemper then hid his mother's corpse in a closet and went to drink at a nearby bar. Upon his return, he invited his mother's best friend, 59-year-old Sarah Taylor, or Sally Hallett, over to the house to have dinner and watch a movie. When Hallett arrived, Kemper strangled her to death to create a cover story that his mother and Hallett had gone away together on vacation. He subsequently put Hallett's corpse in a closet, obscured any outward sign of a disturbance, and left a note to the police. And the note read, "Approximately 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer any more at the hands of this horrible murderous butcher. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it, not sloppy and incomplete. Just a lack of time. I got things to do."
I guess, yeah, it's premeditated, and you can see how he's thinking about his every move, sort of how is he creating an own alibi for himself, and how is he paving his way into what he believes will stop him getting caught.
I think the strangest thing about this for me is the fact that he thinks this is okay, and he's almost trying to, almost try and create this story or narrative to the police that it was the right thing to do.
Well, I guess, yes, serial killers always have a way of justifying their actions because they believe them to be correct. So I guess this is just another example portrayed in a very different way.
So afterwards, Kemper fled the scene. He drove non-stop to Pueblo, Colorado, taking caffeine pills to stay awake for the over 1,000 mile, so that's about 1.6 thousand kilometers journey. He had 3 guns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition in his car, and he believed he was the target of an active manhunt. After not hearing any news on the radio about the murders of his mother and Hallett when he arrived in Pueblo, he found a phone booth and called the police. He confessed to the murders of his mother and Hallett, but the police did not take his call seriously and told him to call back at a later time. Several hours later, Kemper called again, asking to speak to an officer he personally knew. He confessed to the officer of the killing his mother and Hallett, then waited for the police to arrive and take him into custody, where he also confessed to the murders of the 6 students.
I mean, that's ridiculous in itself. No matter how crazy a claim or a phone call might sound, you can't just ignore it and brush it off, because although a lot of prank calls are made, some of them are going to be real, and you have to investigate everything.
It's just, obviously, remember, this is, quite a long time ago. This probably wasn't a usual thing for police to come across, but still they should have taken action. If someone called me and I was a police officer and someone said that, first thing I'd do is go pick them up.
Especially in a time where serial killers were rampant. This wasn't, and he wasn't the only one active around this time. There was plenty of serial killers, so it should have been on their mind that this is something that could easily have happened.
So when asked in a later interview why he turned himself in, Kemper said, "The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. Emotionally, I couldn't handle it much longer. Toward the end there, I started feeling the folly of the whole damn thing, and at that point of near exhaustion, near collapse, I just said to hell with it and called it all off."
That's weird, because once again he's now showing what you'd perceive to be human emotions, and it's very uncharacteristic of a serial killer.
So this leads us finally to his trial. So Kemper was indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder on May the 7th, 1973. He was assigned the Chief Public Defender of Santa Cruz County, Attorney Jim Jackson. So due to Kemper's explicit and detailed confession, his counsel's only option was to plead not guilty by reason of insanity to the charges. Kemper twice tried to commit suicide in custody, and his trial went ahead on October the 23rd, 1973.
Okay. So I guess, once again, it comes back to control. I guess he wants to still control the situation.
And his only defence, that he had any defence is quite worrying, was that they were trying to plead that he was insane.
I mean, some serial killers do come across as insane, but he doesn't strike me as someone who's insane. It's very pathological, very methodical, and he was meticulous in not only his own life, but also in the creation of the events that led to the tragic murders.
So 3 court-appointed psychiatrists found Kemper to be legally sane, and one of the psychiatrists, Dr. Joel Fort, investigated his juvenile records and the diagnosis that he was once psychotic. Fort also interviewed Kemper, including under truth serum, and relayed to the court that Kemper had engaged in cannibalism, alleging that he sliced flesh from the legs of his victims, then cooked and consumed these strips of flesh in a casserole.
Interesting.
Nevertheless, Fort determined that Kemper was fully cognizant in each case and stated that Kemper enjoyed the prospect of the infamy associated with being labelled a murderer. Kemper later recanted the confession of cannibalism.
Yeah, I mean, it just doesn't fit what he's been doing, and I guess, it comes back to the fact that he was so sure with all the ammunition in his car that there was going to be some sort of manhunt for him, and I guess, the disappointment was overwhelming.
California used the Nathan Standard, which held that for a defendant to establish a defence on the ground of insanity, it must be clearly proved that, at the time of the committing of the act, the party accused was labouring under such a defect of reason from disease of mind, and not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know he was doing what was wrong. So Kemper appeared to have known that the nature of his acts were wrong, and he had shown signs of malice aforethought. On November the 1st, Kemper took the stand. He testified that he killed the victims because he wanted them for myself-like possessions, and attempted to convince the jury that he was insane based on the reasoning that his actions could have been committed only by someone with an aberrant mind. He said that 2 beings inhabited his body, and that when the killer personality took over, it was kind of like blacking out.
So I guess it comes back to the initial diagnosis, which I guess is now free for everyone to see, so definitely trying to play on that.
So on November the 8th, 1973, the 6-man, 6-woman jury deliberated for 5 hours before finally declaring Kemper sane and therefore guilty on all counts. He asked for the death penalty, requesting death by torture.
Yeah, that was something that really interested me. It was sort of later on when people would people would interview him in prison, he would say that he believed his punishment should be death by torture, and he maintained that as in, so he's definitely got some consciousness that understands what he's done is wrong.
I think that's kind of what I thought about this when I was researching it, that he clearly, like you said, knew what he was doing, so therefore he was not, clinically insane. He also knew that, it was awful, and his actions were absolutely abhorrent.
And his frustration, and the only reason he was caught was because he turned himself in. So, you don't show those reactions unless you are in control of what you are doing.
So even though he asked for the death penalty, with a moratorium placed on capital punishment by the Supreme Court of California, he instead received 7 years to life for each count. So with these terms to be served concurrently, and was sentenced to the California Medical Facility, which he is still at today.
And rightly so. I mean, I think especially when you've done something like this, you shouldn't get off easy.
And that really wraps up everything on Ed Kemper for this episode.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. It's really informative, and it's a subject that I have been really interested in, just because he's very, very different to your sort of normal serial killer. There are signs where he's just psychotic and violent, but then there are also very, very tiny glimpses of where he shows empathy, especially with things like his granddad, which for a second you could be misguided to believe that he was of a sane and normal person as opposed to a violent serial killer.
With this podcast, with this episode, I just want to really stress that we are not trying to, justify the actions of Kemper. It's just one of the cases that, like Lee has just said, are actually quite interesting because it's different, because he doesn't really fit the profile or the stereotypical profile of a serial killer that we know today.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly not glorifying it in any way.
So, moving on, what have we got coming up in our next episode?
So, our next episode is going to be a two-parter, which will both be released on Saturday together. And this will be on the Son of Sam, or the 44 caliber killer, or David Berkowitz, as he's commonly known. And the reason that it's going to be two parts is just there is so much information to get through, especially with the new documentary that was released this year based on Maury Terry's efforts to uncover additional links to Satanism, and also the prospect of there being more than one Son of Sam killer. So although we'll touch on that briefly, we are going to go into a lot of detail about his life.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I know it was pretty gruesome. And yeah, we will definitely see you next episode.
Yeah, and as always, if you would like to get in touch with us, or if you'd like to ask a question or make a suggestion, then you can get in touch with us at uncoveringhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And if you would like to see more details about us or our reasoning for creating this podcast, you can head over to www.uncoveringhistory.co.uk.
And don't forget to check us out on Instagram. We are at Uncovering History Podcast. It'd be great to see some of your likes.
Brilliant. And thank you very much for this, Lucy.
No problem.
All right, we'll see you soon.
Take care.